You think your last job interview was awkward? Maybe you fumbled your strengths and weaknesses. Maybe you sweat through your shirt. Maybe you forgot the interviewer's name. But at least you didn't have to wrestle a lion, recite your family lineage backward, or prove your worth by surviving a famine. In the ancient world, getting a job wasn't about resumes. It was about bloodlines, loyalty oaths, and sometimes actual blood. Welcome to a world where the phrase competitive job market was taken literally. And yes, you're probably not qualified. If you're still employed after watching this, congrats. Hit subscribe for more history that reminds you how much worse it could be, and how weird it actually was. Ah yes, the ancient Egyptian job interview. Imagine it now. Papyrus resume rolled tightly under your arm, sweat beading beneath your linen tunic, hoping the gods and the hiring priest are in a good mood today. You're here to apply for one of the most sought-after careers in the New Kingdom, a temple scribe. Sounds cushy, right? Sitting cross-legged in the shade, writing holy words while everyone else bakes in the sun building pyramids. But before you get too comfortable, know this. Mess up a single hieroglyph, and you might accidentally summon a demon or miswrite a royal decree that gets someone beheaded. So, no pressure. Let's start with the basics. Ancient Egypt wasn't exactly brimming with LinkedIn pages or open office interviews with a panel of smiling HR reps. No. Here your interview was more of an ancient trial by papyrus. Scribes were the elite literati of society, the human printers of the divine, and the only people trusted to write down what the gods supposedly thought. To land the job you had to start young, very young. As in, we just weaned you off the crocodile milk. Young. The training schools, known as the House of Life, were not places of enlightenment and free expression. They were boot camps, with ink stains. Imagine a 7-year-old sitting in a windowless room for hours, practicing how to draw birds, snakes and suspiciously complex owls until their hands cramped. Want to write sun? That's 3 different symbols and one very angry teacher, breathing down your neck because your falcon looks more like a wounded duck. If you survived your childhood without breaking your stylus in despair, then came the real tests. Memorization. You had to internalize reams of legal codes, religious hymns, and court phrases. And we're not talking bullet-pointed notes. These were poetic, metaphor-laden texts that sounded like fortune cookies written by someone on day 3 of a dehydration spell. Miss a word? Misalign a glyph? You could accidentally transcribe divine blessing as plague of frogs. Not a great way to start your temple career. Now, let's talk attire. You'd assume you'd be judged by your intellect. But no, your clothes mattered. Scribes were supposed to look clean, holy, and only mildly sleep-deprived. No visible lice. No weird smells. And certainly no tunic stains shaped like the Eye of Horus. Unless it was intentional. Personal grooming was a reflection of divine order, which is a long-winded way of saying, don't show up looking like you slept in a tomb, because odds are they'd check. So you're dressed right, you've got your reed brush, and your hieratic handwriting is as sharp as a crocodile's grin. Great. Now eat some ink. Yes, you read that right. One of the more humiliating tests for a budding scribe involved consuming a bit of their own ink mixture to prove they could endure the bitterness of the written word. The logic? If you can stomach the ink, you can stomach the life. And since ink was made from soot, gum and water, sometimes flavored with copper oxide or lead, you were basically licking an ancient battery. Let that sink in. Now, if you're not trying to become a scribe, but maybe a priest or, I don't know, a professional organ remover, aka an embalmer, your interview was even weirder. First off, embalmers weren't just handed a scalpel and told to get to work. They were vetted, deeply. You had to demonstrate an emotional numbness to death, a reverence for the ritual, and ironically, the ability to smell absolutely nothing. These job interviews often took place in the necropolis, where you demonstrate your skills on a fresh cadaver while elder embalmers literally watched from the shadows. Please describe a time when you worked well under pressure. Well, I once removed a liver during a flood. Teamwork. I coordinated with 3 jackal-headed gods while being ankle-deep in intestines. Some jobs required you to be spiritually pure. That means no impure thoughts, no lies, no flatulence near sacred altars. Fail any of these tests? You're not just fired. You might be cursed, or worse, banished to work in the granaries, and nobody wants to spend the rest of eternity measuring grain for a cranky tax collector named Hotep. Still, for the lucky few who passed, prestige, access, scrolls. You were suddenly the one writing contracts, recording conquests, and being trusted with secrets kings wouldn't whisper to their own wives. The pen really was mightier than the spear, especially when you controlled who got remembered and who didn't. But the job didn't end with writing. You had to copy spells from the Book of the Dead without accidentally giving the deceased directions to the wrong afterlife. Imagine your GPS saying turn left at the second underworld gate. And oops, you're now being judged by the wrong deity. Hope you brought extra hearts for weighing. And yet, despite all this, despite the endless memorization, the ink-stained tongues, the pressure of eternal consequences, thousands of young Egyptians trained every year for the chance to become one of these elite. Because even then, people just wanted a little job security, and maybe a good seat in the afterlife. So you want a job in ancient Sparta. How exciting. Let me guess, you're good under pressure. Thrive in a fast-paced environment, and work well in teams. Adorable. Here's the actual listing. Position, full-time human weapon. Salary, glory, fear, and possibly an early grave. Benefits, exposure to the elements, constant violence, no shoes. Welcome to the most soul-crushing job interview in ancient history. Sparta's agoge. That's not just a fun Greek word. It's a state-sponsored meat grinder that turned children into warriors, one bruised ego at a time. You see, in most societies, childhood is about gentle exploration and self-discovery. In Sparta, it was about not dying. The interview process started at birth. Literally, when a Spartan boy was born, elders inspected him for physical defects. If he didn't pass inspection, if he was too weak, too small, or just vaguely disappointing, they threw him off a cliff. That was stage 1 of the hiring process. Survive that? Great. At age 7, you're yanked from your family and chucked into the agoge, a government-run, misery-fueled boot camp designed to forge perfect soldiers. The word agoge itself means leading or guidance, which is a poetic way of describing institutionalized brutality. Training began immediately. You were given a single garment for the entire year. No shoes, no blankets, no whining. Food? Scarce. On purpose. You were expected to steal to survive. Because hey, nothing says character development like sanctioned theft. But if you got caught, you weren't punished for stealing. No, you were punished for being bad at it. Because nothing says growth opportunity like being flogged for sloppy espionage at age 10. And yes, there were beatings. Daily ones. Sometimes ceremonial, sometimes just because your instructor didn't like your face. In one charming tradition, boys were whipped at the altar of Artemis Orthia until they either passed out or died. The winner was whoever stayed conscious the longest. HR was not involved. Now, imagine a modern resume with bullet points like endured hunger to sharpen moral compass, survived exposure to winter without clothing, flogged 42 times without sobbing. And here's the kicker. This wasn't even the final round. That came at 12. Puberty, emotions, dreams. Too bad. This is where things got really serious. Boys were grouped into herds led by older teens who acted as both mentors and tormentors. Oh, and yes, these older boys were encouraged to form mentoring relationships, a polite euphemism for state-sanctioned grooming. Apparently, the Spartans believed that bonding through trauma and romantic entanglement built loyalty, and maybe it did. It also built a culture of normalized pain and silence. Let that sink in. At 16, the truly elite candidates were selected for a special, secret society, the Cryptia. This was the Black Ops wing of the agoge. Think of it as an unpaid internship in state terrorism. The task: wander the countryside at night and murder any enslaved helot who looked a little too confident. The goal was fear, total, unrelenting fear. It wasn't about justice. It was job security. For Sparta, not for you. Still think your unpaid internship was bad? The agoge didn't just teach fighting. It taught obedience, suppression, and how to smile while bleeding. Crying was unacceptable. So was weakness. So was losing at wrestling. Unless you wanted to spend the next week eating with the donkeys. And don't even think about poetry, unless it involved war, honor, or insulting Athens. Graduating from the agoge didn't get you a trophy. It got you a cloak. That was it. A single scarlet cloak. No diploma, no party. Just a symbol that you had survived. Barely. And yet, There was pride in it. Strange, fierce pride. The Agoge bonded its survivors in a way few things could. You didn't just learn to fight, you learned to become a blade in the hands of the state. Individuality was melted down and reforged into something communal, unbreakable, and terrifying. Now pause for a moment. Breathe that in. The dust of the training field, the cold sweat of a 12-year-old trying not to cry, the silence of a night patrol, where failure means death, not from the enemy, but from your own people. What does it say about a society where strength is measured in scars and silence? How would your resume hold up if showed weakness was a disqualifier at age 7? It's easy to look back and marvel at Sparta's military might, its discipline, its poetic reputation as a warrior culture. But those myths were forged on the backs of traumatized children who never got to be anything else. They weren't interviewed, they were conditioned, reprogrammed, broken and rebuilt until they didn't remember what it meant to be afraid. Or maybe they still were, just better at hiding it. So the next time you're prepping for an interview and worried about saying too much or not having 5-year goals, just remember at least nobody's making you strangle a helot to prove your loyalty. So, you think you've got what it takes to be the divine mouthpiece of the gods. That's cute. But before you imagine yourself lounging in a linen robe, whispering riddles to terrified generals, let's set the record straight. Becoming an oracle wasn't some ancient version of being a quirky lifestyle coach. It was more like being a professional hallucination with job security. Welcome to Delphi, home of Apollo's favorite hotline. In its prime, this sacred sanctuary was the place to ask life's big questions. Who should I marry? Should we invade Persia? Is it okay to open that mysterious box labeled "Do Not Open"? But behind every grand prophecy was a trembling woman who had to inhale noxious fumes, fast for days, and answer in rhyming couplets while people scribbled down her every word like it was Yelp for fate. Now, let's talk qualifications. First, you had to be female, preferably local, preferably middle-aged. Virgins were initially required, but after a few too many incidents involving high-profile customers and inappropriate advances, looking at you rich Athenian generals, they pivoted to older women pretending to be virgins. Yes, Delphi invented resume padding. Once hired, the Pythia's new job was to get high. Seriously, her chamber sat atop a chasm that belched out fumes, probably ethylene gas according to modern geology. But to ancient eyes, this was divine breath. She would sit on a sacred tripod above the cleft, chew laurel leaves, drink from the Castalian spring, and then wait until her eyeballs started vibrating. And that's when the performance began. Picture it, a room thick with incense, priests flanking the oracle, petitioners lined up with sweaty palms and existential dread. The Pythia starts babbling. Not speaking, babbling, incoherent fragments. Sometimes screams, sometimes whispers. Her mouth froths. Her limbs twitch. She channels Apollo, or possibly carbon monoxide. Either way, it's working. Now, the priests, those ever-helpful middle managers, would transcribe her divine gibberish into elegant riddles, because nothing says job clarity like a prophecy that could mean 3 different things, and doom an empire if misread. You will conquer if you cross the river. But who will conquer? You, your enemies, the local goose. Let that sink in. You've waited weeks, paid in goats, offered up your most prized olive oil, and your answer boils down to yes and no. But also, pine cones. This was not just a job, it was a full-body spiritual marathon. The Pythia couldn't work every day. Her divine gigs were scheduled only a few times a year, and only on certain days that had been triple-checked with astrological calendars, sacred rituals, and probably Mercury in retrograde. On non-working days, silence. On bad days, collapse. The fumes weren't exactly OSHA-compliant, and after enough sessions even the most robust oracle began to resemble a startled corpse with excellent posture. Yet still they came, kings, soldiers, philosophers, all desperate to outsource their decisions to a woman in a gas chamber. And here's where it gets even more corporate. The priests, they made bank. Every consultation required payment, livestock, jewels, favors, and while the Pythia raved herself into dehydration, the temple coffers overflowed. There was an entire ecosystem built around divine ambiguity. Economists would be proud, but don't think it was all spiritual glamour. If the Pythia gave a prophecy someone didn't like, things could turn ugly. Imagine getting blamed for a military disaster because your divine vibes were slightly off that day. The pressure wasn't just divine, it was political. Your every word could send armies marching or empires collapsing. Still watching? Good. Breathe that in. Methane. Maybe. Definitely destiny. Now, not every ancient oracle operated under the same aromatic conditions. Other temples, like Didymia or Dodona, had their own flavor of weird. At Dodona, for instance, priests listened to the rustling of oak leaves to interpret Zeus's will, which means somewhere out there, someone was hired for their ability to understand tree gossip. But Delphi remained the gold standard. If you made it there, you weren't just an oracle, you were the oracle. The voice of Apollo, a one-woman think tank shrouded in smoke and suspense. And yet, behind all the spectacle, there's something oddly human about it. People lining up, desperate for answers, hoping for clarity, willing to accept riddles if it meant feeling seen. The Pythia may have been high out of her mind, but she held power, terrible, beautiful, mysterious power, and sometimes that power was used to help, to guide, to give hope. Other times, well, ask Croesus how his war went. So next time you're frustrated by an automated helpline or an interview panel asking, "Where do you see yourself in 5 years?" Remember the women who sat atop volcanic fissures raving through sacred smoke, tasked with giving life-altering advice to men with swords and egos, and all without spilling a single cup of laurel tea, long before you were sweating through a job interview in a badly lit office, or refreshing. Indeed, for the 6th time today, ancient China had already perfected the art of soul-destroying career auditions. Welcome to the imperial exam system, where ambition went to die, and scholars willingly gave up their 20s, 30s, and occasionally sanity just for the chance to get a government job writing legal memos for a warlord. This wasn't just a job application. This was the Hunger Games of bureaucracy. Let's start with the basics. The imperial examination, or Keiju, began sometime around the Sui dynasty, reached full masochistic glory in the Tang and Song eras, and continued because pain is apparently timeless, until that's over 1,300 years of generation after generation, willingly diving into a scholastic black hole, just to become what was essentially a well-dressed administrator with lifelong back pain. Now the test. Oh, the test. You studied. Not for weeks, not for months, for decades. Candidates started as literal children, tutored in the 4 books, the 5 classics, and Confucian doctrine so dense it makes tax law look like a coloring book. The goal wasn't just to understand the content, it was to memorize it. All of it, entire passages, word for word. Misquote Confucius, you fail. Accidentally swap a metaphor about filial piety, you fail. Use the wrong brushstroke on a character, goodbye. It was a test so rigorous, it made the SAT look like a BuzzFeed quiz. And the setting? Oh, that was delightful. You weren't sitting at a desk with a cup of coffee and a Spotify playlist. You were confined alone in a stone examination cell, barely large enough to lie down. Think monk's cell meets medieval porta potty. You brought food, ink, paper, and ideally the will to live. Some stayed locked in for 3 days straight. Some died in there, literally, from stress, heat, or just giving up. But if you survived the physical ordeal, then came the content: poetry composition, essay writing, moral quandaries, classical interpretation, and, just for fun, calligraphy that needed to be as flawless as it was philosophically deep. The graders were anonymous, but ruthless. A smudge in your ink? Fail. A whiff of unoriginal thought? Fail harder. Still sound like a good job prospect. And here's the kicker. Even if you pass this nightmare, after years, sometimes decades of grueling preparation, you weren't guaranteed employment. Oh no, you were now qualified to take a higher exam. There were tiers: local, provincial, metropolitan, and finally the palace exam. Imagine doing 5 full marathons just to qualify for a second, more exclusive marathon, where you have to write an essay while being judged by the emperor himself. Speaking of emperors, here's where it gets delightfully absurd. One famous emperor, Song Renzong, if you're keeping track, once disguised himself as a common candidate and snuck into the examination to see what all the fuss was about. His essay? Mediocre. He failed his own exam. That's right. The guy who designed the test couldn't pass it. Let that sink in. Still, the allure was undeniable. If you did pass, you were now a scholar official, a member of the literati. You got robes, stipends, status, and the right to be smug at parties. In many ways, this was the only meritocratic path in ancient China. You didn't need noble blood, just a steel spine and a photographic memory, and perhaps a therapist, which, tragically, had yet to be invented. But the pressure, crushing. Whole families banked their futures on a son passing the exam. If he succeeded, the household ascended in status. If he failed, over and over and over again, well, there's a reason disappointed Confucian father is a recurring theme in Chinese literature. And don't assume it was all fair. Cheating was a national sport. People smuggled crib sheets sewn into clothing, memorized coded songs, or bribed examiners, despite the risk of being exiled, executed, or both. The stakes were so high that some dynasties had entire squads of anti-cheating officials whose job was to sniff out scholarly mischief. Imagine a secret police force, but for pop quizzes. And yet, the exam endured. For over 1,000 years, it shaped not just who got jobs, but what ideas survived. It enshrined Confucianism as the backbone of statecraft, social order, and dinner table lectures from disappointed uncles. But here's the twist. The imperial exam system wasn't designed to find creative thinkers. It was meant to create replicas, loyal, literate, and obedient. The perfect civil servant wasn't a genius. He was a photocopier with a pulse. Still, for those who passed, the rewards were immense. You could rise from peasantry to prominence. You could write policy, shape dynasties, become the kind of person historians remember, and whose footnotes bore future generations into deep slumber. And for all its faults, the system was oddly egalitarian, at least in theory. No matter your background, you could rise, and fail, and rise again, which made the exam a cruel, beautiful paradox. A system that demanded the best from everyone, and gave dignity to few. So, the next time you grumble about filling out a job application or rehearsing your answer to what's your biggest weakness, remember this. At least you don't have to memorize all of Confucius and sit in a concrete cell while reciting poetry in perfect ink strokes for a shot at becoming the assistant to the assistant governor of rice taxation in Henan. So you want to be a Viking? That's adorable. Let's just rip off the helmet-shaped band-aid now. There were no formal applications, no resumes written in runes, no warm handshake from a chieftain and a tell me about a time you worked well in a team. In Viking society, a job interview typically involved beer, violence, and whether or not you could row until your hands bled without complaining. First things first, forget the horned helmet. That's a Victorian fantasy cooked up by someone who had clearly never fought in one. Real Vikings looked like unwashed steel hurricanes. If you wanted in on the action, raiding, pillaging, navigating across seas more chaotic than your group chat, you needed to prove yourself. Not with words, with scars. The process began young. Viking boys were raised with the understanding that one day they might go a Viking. Yes, it was a verb. Not everyone did, but for those who did, the expectations were clear. Be strong, be brutal, and for Odin's sake, be useful. Strength wasn't just admired, it was currency, loyalty, even more so. But humor, a close third. You needed to be able to laugh when your ship capsized and you lost your sword to the North Sea. Now, say you wanted to join a crew. Maybe you heard that Bjorn Ironside was gathering warriors for a little sightseeing trip to England. Here's how that process went. Step 1. Show up at the Longhouse. No invitation needed. Just walk in, ideally dragging something impressive behind you. A bear, a shield you stole, a man you bested in a drinking contest. Look intimidating, or at least deeply unhinged. Step 2. Participate in the feast. This wasn't just about food. It was a loyalty test, a vibe check, and a low-stakes brawl, all in one. There would be mead, possibly spiked with hallucinogenic mushrooms, and lots of staring contests. If someone made fun of your beard, and you didn't immediately threaten them with a broken bone flute, you probably didn't get the job. Step 3. Demonstrate value. Could you repair a sail? Cook something that didn't immediately kill people? Tell a saga without boring your audience? Vikings valued versatility. If you could swing a sword and sing a sea shanty, you were golden. One crew even recruited a guy because he could make convincing ship sounds with his mouth. You laugh, but they survived a storm because of his mimicry. There were no background checks. No HR manager. confirming your last raid. But there was a trial run. Before setting sail, new crew members often had to prove themselves in combat drills or minor raids. Think of it as an unpaid internship with swords. And if you messed up, you weren't just cut, you were thrown overboard, or worse, left behind with the cows. Now, let's talk culture fit. Viking crews were tight-knit. You didn't just need to fight well, you needed to bond. That meant swearing blood oaths, participating in deeply uncomfortable chants, and maybe tattooing something questionable on your back. One crew made new recruits sleep outside the longhouse for a week to prove they could handle cold, wolves, and crippling loneliness. Team-building exercises were different back then. Still watching? Then here's the fun part. Success as a Viking wasn't just about brute force, it was about glory. Every raid was a potential resume builder. Sack a monastery, boom, leadership potential. Navigate stormy seas, logistics and transportation experience. Survive hand-to-hand combat with an angry monk, conflict resolution. And here's the philosophical kicker. The Vikings weren't just looking for people who could fight. They were looking for people who could die well. Dying with bravery meant entry to Valhalla, their mythical warrior afterlife, where the mead flowed forever, and the beds were probably made of furs. Cowardice, however, got you hell. Not hell. Hell, a much colder, significantly lamer version of the afterlife, where you probably had to relive your worst defeats on repeat while wearing damp socks. Let that sink in. The job interview didn't just ask if you were willing to die, it asked how. With courage, with a battle cry, or with a whimper while trying to hide behind the guy with the bigger axe. One recorded story tells of a young man, Eric, who tried to fake his way onto a crew by boasting of imaginary conquests. During the first raid, he hid in the boat. The others found him weeping into a barrel of pickled herring. They named him Eric the Moist, and left him in a bog. Nobody ever hired him again. But for those who passed, camaraderie, purpose, a life defined by action, danger, and occasional poetry. Yes, poetry. Vikings recited skaldic verse, praising each other's deeds in elaborate metaphors. He who struck the skull surf with the iron scream sounds a lot cooler than Kevin's good with an axe. And while we often picture them as mindless marauders, many Vikings were craftsmen, traders, and navigators. But make no mistake, raiding was the resume item everyone wanted. It was sexy. It was profitable. It was the Viking equivalent of Fortune 500 experience. So next time you're prepping for an interview and you're asked, what's your greatest strength? Just be grateful that your answer doesn't need to involve surviving a bear hug from a berserker while paddling across an ice fjord at dawn. Gladiators, the rock stars of ancient Rome. If you thought job hunting today was brutal, try navigating a labor market where your onboarding process included a chance of disembowelment in front of 50,000 screaming fans. And yes, there were recruiters, because even in ancient times someone had to say, "Hey, you've got great bone structure. Have you considered professional blood sport?" Let's start at the top. Gladiators weren't just a random collection of angry shirtless men. They were trained, marketed, and believe it or not, hired. The entire industry was run by Lannister gladiator managers who acted as a mix between talent scouts, sports agents, and ruthless human traffickers. They owned Ludi, the training schools where recruits were transformed from unremarkable nobodies into finely honed killing machines with tragic backstories and fan clubs. So where did these recruits come from? Step 1. Don't volunteer. Seriously, most gladiators didn't sign up because they dreamed of holding a sword while a tiger eyed them like a snack. They were prisoners of war, slaves, or criminals given the charming option, fight in the arena, or rot in a cell. Occasionally, however, free men did volunteer. These were known as octorati, usually bankrupt, desperate, or high on whatever version of TikTok clout existed in 7. If you did volunteer, you signed a contract. Yes, a real one. It detailed how long you'd fight, what type of weapons you'd use, and, most awkward of all, how much your family would be paid if your spleen was relocated without your consent. You also had to swear an oath. In short, I agree to be burned, bound, beaten, and killed by the sword. Not quite. I'm a team player with a flexible attitude. But close. Enter the recruiters. These guys weren't lurking on LinkedIn. They were prowling markets, jails, and battlefields, looking for prime meat. Broad shoulders? Excellent. Missing an eye but still standing? Even better. They judged strength, reflexes, charisma. Some even faked fights to see how a candidate handled surprise. One famous Lanista, Lentulus Batiatus, was known for snatching up prisoners and turning them into arena legends. His school in Capua, that's where Spartacus got his start. You know, the guy who later led a 70,000-man rebellion, because he was understandably not thrilled with the workplace culture. Now let's say you got picked. Congratulations, you've been accepted into Gladiator Boot Camp. Your new home is a crowded dormitory next to a training pit that smells like sweat, sand, and resignation. Your daily schedule includes weapons drills, conditioning exercises, and meals packed with carbs. Why? Because gladiators needed to bulk up, not for strength, but for aesthetics. A nice layer of fat protected vital organs, and made wounds look gorier without immediately killing you. Rome loved a good show after all, and image mattered. Gladiators were branded, often literally, tattoos marked them as property. But if you survived long enough, you became a celebrity. Murals, clay figurines, and graffiti all celebrated the most famous fighters. One scratched message on a Pompeii wall reads, "Saladus, the Thracian, makes the girls sigh." So yes, there were groupies, even for men who spent their afternoons screaming in the dust. Still watching? Then picture this. You've trained for months. You've learned to use the gladius, the net, the trident. You've taken beatings from a guy named Cassius who smells like olives and anger. Now, it's fight day. You're led into the Colosseum, Rome's corporate office of death. Tens of thousands cheer. You squint into the sun, see your opponent, and realize he has the same look in his eye. The eye really didn't read the fine print look. The fight begins. You block, strike, duck. Blood hits the sand. Maybe yours, maybe his. If you survive, the crowd may decide your fate. A thumbs up might let you live. A thumbs down? Time to meet Pluto. But here's the catch. Thumbs down didn't actually mean death. Historians now believe it was the opposite. The real signal was more complicated. Either way, you were one bad mood away from a short career. And yet, some gladiators thrived. Those with skill, charisma, and luck could earn their freedom. They were awarded a wooden sword, rudis, as a symbol of retirement. Imagine getting a little wooden stick after risking your life 87 times, but it meant everything. Freedom, autonomy, a chance to leave behind the blood and sand and become a trainer, or, if lucky, open a tavern and live out your days telling tall tales to drunk fishermen. But for many, the job ended early. Some within months. Others lasted a few years. Death was a co-worker, always looming, never off duty. So yes, there were recruiters, there was training, there was pay modest, but sometimes enough to buy your freedom. But it all came at the cost of your body, your agency, and often your life. And if you didn't get the job, you still fought. Just unpaid. Medieval Europe. A land of plagues, piety, and professional gatekeeping. If you wanted a respectable career, say as a blacksmith, a baker, or a candle maker, who definitely wasn't doubling as a poisoner, you had one path, the guild system. Picture it as a medieval LinkedIn, but with more secrets, fewer endorsements, and the occasional public flogging. Guilds were trade organizations run by master craftsmen who controlled the flow of work, apprenticeships, pricing, and in some cases, local politics. Want to open your own shop? Sorry, not unless you passed their trial, which made modern job interviews look like a polite brunch. Let's say you're an eager young lad, age 12, covered in soot and enthusiasm, hoping to become a blacksmith. You don't just stroll into the forge and ask for an internship. First, you become an apprentice. Translation: you live with your master, obey every order, and work long hours doing the tasks no one else wants, like scraping rust out of horseshoes or hauling 200-pound bellows across town. Apprenticeships lasted years. Not months. Years. You were effectively indentured, often bound by a contract signed by your parents, who, let's be honest, probably just wanted you out of the house. During this time, you earned no money. None. Your payment was the privilege of being yelled at while learning how not to die near molten iron. But if you survived that, physically and emotionally, you could graduate to the next level. Journeyman. Now you could earn wages. Not much, but enough to buy meat that wasn't entirely spoiled. You traveled from town to town, learning from different masters. Think of it as a roving resume booster, plus the added bonus of highway robbery and communicable diseases. Here's where it gets spicy. To become a master, you had to submit a masterpiece. Yes, that's where the term comes from. It wasn't a metaphor, it was literal. You had to craft an object, armor, bread, stained glass that was so perfect, so flawless. The guild would collectively nod and say, yes, you may now overcharge peasants for your goods. But don't assume they were rooting for you. The guild examiners were notoriously picky. That sword, too heavy. That tapestry, one thread out of place. That loaf of bread, too chewy, and not in a charming rustic way. The goal wasn't just excellence, it was conformity. Innovation was suspicious. Flourishes, dangerous. You were judged not only on your skill, but how well you replicated centuries of tradition without daring to be original. Still, you weren't just tested on your work. Some guilds threw in extra challenges, tests of honesty, endurance, or obscure knowledge. One blacksmith guild required candidates to forge a horseshoe using only their non-dominant hand while being shouted at in Latin. A baker's guild, charmingly, insisted candidates bake bread with ingredients provided by the examiners. The twist? Those ingredients were often spoiled. The goal wasn't deliciousness. It was survival. And yes, there was hazing. Gentle, humiliating hazing. Apprentices were often forced to wear ridiculous outfits, perform degrading tasks, or recite absurd oaths. One guild made new journeymen carry a heavy sack of flour around town, while shouting, "I am unworthy but hopeful." Another required the candidate to eat his own test sausage in front of a crowd, while the guildmaster stared silently, judging his chewing technique. Let that sink in. You trained for 10 years and your fate came down to a meat cube and eye contact. Now, if you failed the test, you weren't necessarily out forever, but you had to start over, often in another city under another master, repeating the same grueling work. The guild wouldn't just let anyone in. Too many masters spoiled the profits. Keeping the club exclusive meant power, and power meant money. But if you passed, then the gates opened. You gained the right to open your own shop, take on apprentices, and participate in guild decisions. You could vote, set prices, and most importantly, wear the official guild badge, which was less bling and more legal immunity. In some towns, only guild members could legally sell certain goods. Without that approval, you were just another street hawker begging for coins and dodging fines. Still watching? Good. Let's not forget the darker side. Guilds weren't just professional clubs. They were gatekeepers of opportunity. Women, in many cases, were excluded entirely, unless they inherited a husband's shop. Non-Christians? Often banned. Foreigners? Viewed with suspicion. The guilds enforced orthodoxy. If you didn't fit, you didn't belong. There were strikes. There were riots. There were full-blown legal battles over whether someone's candle was too long, or whether a butcher's meat had been blessed properly. One weaver's guild tried to ban competitors from using looms made of a different wood. Another forbade singing while working, lest joy become a distraction. But amidst the bureaucracy and the power plays, there was also solidarity. Guilds offered support for widows, burial funds, and emergency loans. If your shop burned down or you fell ill, your fellow members helped you get back on your feet, unless of course you'd been voted most annoying journeyman 3 years running. So yes, the medieval guild trial was a job interview like no other. Long, petty, painful, and profoundly political. One job required eating your own product, even when it was possibly fatal. Now here's a job title you probably didn't see in your high school career fair: Royal Eunuch. Benefits include close access to the throne, unmatched political influence, and of 100% guaranteed absence of future heirs. But before you glamorize the perks, let's address the elephant, or shall we say, the absence of the elephant, in the room. The interview process for becoming a eunuch wasn't so much a conversation as it was a procedure, and it involved a knife. In many ancient empires, China, Byzantium, the Islamic caliphates, and a few especially overachieving courts in India, the most trusted court officials were eunuchs. Why? Because kings and emperors had trust issues. If you were guarding the harem, raising the royal children, or managing the treasury, your employer wanted to ensure you weren't secretly plotting a family dynasty. The solution? Remove the possibility. Eunuchs were considered the ultimate neutral party. No wives, no kids, no bloodlines, no agenda. You existed entirely for the service of the state, or more specifically, the person sitting on the golden chair and worrying about assassination. Let's start in Imperial China, the spiritual home of bureaucratic horror with a side of sharp objects. Becoming a eunuch wasn't a decision you made lightly, or often at all. Most eunuchs were either enslaved or offered by desperate families who thought sacrificing one son might improve the future of the rest. A tragic trade, your fertility in exchange for your family's upward mobility. What kind of system hires you by destroying your future? The procedure itself was comprehensive. Some cultures performed partial castration. The Chinese, ever efficient, removed everything. The technical term was total emasculation, a euphemism perhaps for excruciating, dangerous, and likely to result in death. You were sedated, barely, and then had your genitals removed in one clean slice. The wound was sealed with wax, and a bamboo tube was inserted to keep you from, well, sealing up like a tragic human Tupperware container. The recovery? Agonizing. The success rate? Not great. If you lived, congratulations. You were now eligible for employment in the Forbidden City, a place that housed thousands of eunuchs and roughly zero emotional support groups. Your new duties could include serving meals, guarding palaces, reporting secrets, grooming emperors, or fanning a cranky concubine for 14 hours straight, all while wearing silk slippers and trying not to bleed out. But here's the wild part. Eunuchs weren't just passive servants. Many became powerful. In some dynasties they ran the empire. They controlled court appointments, oversaw military campaigns, and influenced succession. The Ming dynasty had entire cliques of eunuchs, who basically functioned as shadow governments. One eunuch, Wei Zhengxin, was so powerful, he had temples built in his name while the actual emperor was still alive. That's not just ambition, that's PR strategy on steroids. Still, life wasn't all power plays and palace intrigue. Many eunuchs were mistreated, mocked, or murdered at the whim of their royal employers. They existed in a bizarre liminal space, essential, yet disposable, revered, yet reviled. You could be the emperor's most trusted advisor one day, and have your head on a pike the next for suggesting he reconsider his 36th concubine's silk allowance. And this wasn't just a Chinese phenomenon. In the Byzantine Empire, eunuchs often served as generals, treasurers, and even patriarchs of the church. One eunuch, Narses, led armies and defeated the Goths. That's right, a man who couldn't legally marry was out there conquering Italy like it was a Tuesday. The Ottoman Empire also had elite eunuchs, the Kızlar Agası and the Kapı Agası, who oversaw the imperial harem and managed the palace hierarchy. These eunuchs, many from sub-Saharan Africa, were gatekeepers to the Sultan himself. Their loyalty was legendary, as was their isolation. Trusted with everything, trusted by no one. Still watching? Then take a moment. Imagine waking up from the interview. You've survived. You've been selected. You'll never have children. You'll never fall in love, without risk. Your entire body has been permanently reshaped for a chance at a career. And all of it, depends on keeping a capricious monarch happy. Some eunuchs rose. Many more disappeared into history, nameless and aching. They were human cautionary tales wrapped in silk robes, visible, yet invisible. The cost of their proximity to power was everything that made them whole. And yet, despite the brutality, the path was chosen, sometimes even willingly. In a society with rigid classes and limited mobility, being a eunuch could vault you from poverty to the inner sanctum of royalty. The higher you climbed, the more you became indispensable, not despite what was taken from you, but because of it. So the next time you complain about a weird interview question or an unpaid internship, remember this. Somewhere, in a silent hall of jade and shadow, a young man once stared at a blade and whispered, "Yes, I'm ready." The Inca Empire. High-altitude splendor, golden temples, stunning stonework, and a human resources department that sometimes required your blood type, or all your blood. If you thought applying for a job in the Andes meant a resume and a nice handshake, think again, because here career advancement occasionally ended with your heart being offered to a volcano. Let's set the scene. The Inca weren't just running a kingdom, they were orchestrating a sprawling civilization across thousands of miles of mountains, valleys, and terror-inducing suspension bridges made of grass. Keeping all that in order required labor, lots of it. But they didn't do resumes, they did mita. Mita was a state-run labor system, and it wasn't optional. Every able-bodied citizen had to contribute time working for the empire. Road building, farming, weaving, military service. It was the Inca's version of civic duty. Mandatory internships and tax collection all rolled into one. And just like most internships, there was no salary. Just the satisfaction of knowing you helped the empire run smoothly and maybe didn't die. But then there were the special jobs. The elite positions. The ones that required something more than strong arms and a good relationship with llamas. Take the akalas, or chosen women. These girls, often selected as young as 8, were plucked from villages based on beauty, grace, or an unfortunate proximity to Inca tax collectors. They were taken to temple compounds, like the Akalawasi, or House of the Chosen, where they were trained in weaving, cooking, religious rituals, and, depending on the empire's needs, how to be sacrificial offerings. Yes, their job interview started with a royal talent scout and ended with a ceremony involving fire or ice. Because here's the real twist. In Inca culture, being sacrificed wasn't a punishment. It was a promotion. You were believed to become immortal, living among the gods, protecting your people from the spiritual realm. A horrifying honor, like getting Employee of the Month. But instead of a plaque, you got mummified and buried at 22,000 feet in a sacred mountaintop tomb. Let that sink in. Your dream job was also your funeral. Still, not every spiritually important role ended in your demise. Some were just highly stressful. Priests, for instance, were selected based on lineage, astronomical knowledge, and their ability to chant for days without collapsing. You had to memorize complex ceremonies, interpret celestial movements, and occasionally oversee animal sacrifices, usually llamas, though guinea pigs were not exempt. If your ritual went well, the empire prospered. If it didn't rain for a month, everyone looked at you sideways. One misplaced chant, and suddenly your status as oracle turned into suspect. Then there were the Kubikamayok, the record keepers. These were the human calculators who managed the empire's logistics through Krupu, a system of knotted strings used to record census data, taxes, and crop yields. To even qualify for this job, you needed an unnaturally good memory, manual dexterity, and a deep understanding of decimal organization in string form. No ink, no paper, just twine and anxiety. And unlike your Excel spreadsheet, a misplaced knot here could throw an entire region's food supply into chaos. Oops. I meant 3,000 potatoes, not 300,000. Was not a great look in the Incan HR files. But not all roles were cerebral. Military commanders were often selected from noble families, and their qualifications included bravery, strategic intelligence, and the ability to terrify enemies just by how loudly they yelled. Promotion was possible, but so was being ritually executed if you lost a key battle. Job reviews were harsh and typically fatal. And then there were the Kapapacho rituals. These were the pinnacle of sacred service. Children, healthy, beautiful, innocent, were selected from across the empire to be sacrificed during times of crisis or royal transitions. This wasn't random. It involved omens, priests, and a disturbingly organized selection process. Families often considered it an honor, believing their child would live on as a divine guardian. The children were dressed in the finest clothes, fed like royalty, and sent on long pilgrimages to mountain summits, where they were sacrificed, sometimes with poison, sometimes by blunt trauma, sometimes simply left to freeze in their sleep. Archaeologists have found these tiny mummies perfectly preserved peaceful expressions, ceremonial tunics, offerings placed beside them. It's devastating, because even through the lens of ritual, faith and historical distance, it's clear these weren't just roles, these were lives, offered up in the name of balance. Still watching? Then pause here, breathe that in, thin, icy air, the crunch of sandals on snow, the last whispered prayers of a child too young to understand the weight of divine promotion. The Inca believed that their world was held together by reciprocity. People gave to the gods, and the gods gave back. Every job, from stonemason to mountain martyr, was part of a cosmic cycle, and while some got to retire with dignity, others did not. So, the next time you grumble about doing unpaid overtime or filling out a W-9, just remember, somewhere in the Andes, a child once climbed toward the heavens with a bundle of coca leaves and a heart full of sacrifice. Because someone said, "We've chosen you." Rome, the land of emperors, aqueducts, and gladiators. But behind every dramatic assassination and wine-fueled orgy was a mountain of paperwork, meticulously recorded, double-sealed, and filed by a man who hadn't seen sunlight since the last consul forgot how to spell his own name. If you think working in an office today is bad, imagine doing it in a toga, hunched over parchment with a stylus made from a bird's femur. Welcome to Roman bureaucracy. Endless, soul-numbing, and somehow still better organized than your local DMV. Let's say you wanted to join the Roman civil service. Maybe you weren't born into a noble family, didn't have the stomach for military conquest, and had no interest in chariot racing. Fine, there was still a path. You could become a scribe, a Roman scribe. You'd start as a glorified office intern, taking notes in the Senate, drafting decrees, and rewriting them because Senator Gaius can't stop using passive voice. To get the job, you needed literacy, a rare and lucrative skill. Less than 15% of the population could read or write, which made you an asset, a living printer, basically, but with more ink stains and less recognition. You'd also need a patron, someone important enough to vouch for you. No patron, no position, unless of course you were enslaved. In which case, congrats. You might be assigned to a bureaucratic role with zero pay and even fewer rights. Your desk came with a view of your own eventual tombstone. Still, if you were lucky or rich enough to fake luck, you could climb the ranks, from scribe to abactis, record keeper to tabularius, accountant. Every government office had layers. The Census Bureau alone had thousands of workers tracking population numbers, property taxes, livestock tallies, and who owned how many slaves, because Rome, naturally, needed receipts for everything. Even your goats had paperwork. Want to be a tax collector? That was a job too. Though more like a nightmare wrapped in parchment and dipped in resentment. You'd get assigned a province, say Hispania. You'd arrive in your finest tunic, scrolls in hand, and immediately be loathed by everyone. No one liked tax collectors, not the locals, not the soldiers, not even other bureaucrats. Your duties included estimating grain yields, encouraging timely payments, and trying not to get stabbed in the neck by a disgruntled farmer with a vendetta and a rusty spade. And don't think for a second that working in Rome proper was easier. The city was packed with paperwork, land deeds, legal transcripts, contracts, marriage records, divorce settlements, adoption certifications, religious exemptions, shipping manifests, and letters to the gods who presumably outsourced their mail to Mercury's overwhelmed interns. The tools of the trade: wooden tablets coated in wax for rough drafts, ink and parchment for final versions. If you messed up, no Control-Z, you scraped off the wax or started from scratch. If you sneezed on a scroll mid-draft, you prayed to Jupiter for forgiveness and rewrote the entire thing. Mistakes were costly not just for you, but for whoever paid for the parchment. 1 sheep per scroll, give or take. Yes, each memo was a small act of agricultural violence. Still watching? Still unemployed? You know what to do. Tap that button. No imperial seal required. Let's not forget about the Cursus Publicus, Rome's official postal service. This marvel of state coordination included relay stations, courier riders, and wagons loaded with sealed documents, traveling hundreds of miles across the empire. But if a message got lost, someone died. Possibly you. Even entertainment had red tape. Gladiator games required permits, animal imports, taxed and inventoried, temple festivals, scheduled months in advance by a team of priests who were also, naturally, civil servants. There were forms for everything: opening a bathhouse, closing a bathhouse, naming a child, unnaming a child, sacrificing a goat, transporting a dead goat, and requesting a priest to verify that said goat had, in fact, been sacrificed. And what did all this get you? Well, if you climbed high enough, say became a questor or ADL, you got prestige, power, a front row seat at political events, and crucially, more paperwork, endless scrolls, office politics, backstabbing, occasional poisonings. You were no longer a slave to a master. You were a slave to the system. The same system you now managed. But for the average scribe, the rewards were modest. A decent wage, a predictable schedule, and perhaps the quiet satisfaction that your carefully copied edict helped sentence a corrupt senator to exile, or at least a strongly worded warning. You got respect, but rarely glory. The history books remember the generals, not the pencil pushers. Unless, of course, you made a transcription error that started a war. That's one way to get famous. So, the next time you're stuck behind a stack of reports, muttering curses at your malfunctioning printer, spare a thought for the Roman bureaucrat, stooped over parchment, ink on his fingers, hand cramping as he rewrites yet another decree from Emperor Tiberius about grain tariffs in Carthage. He died as he lived, surrounded by paperwork, unthanked, unremembered, and probably still behind on his filings. So, you want to ride with the Mongols? Bold choice. Most people in the 13th century tried very hard not to meet them, but maybe you're tired of farming turnips, or you've got an unquenchable thirst for conquest, fermented milk, and setting entire cities on fire. Great, before you pack your saddlebag, let's talk about the recruitment process, which was less job interview and more survive the raid and prove you're useful. Let's start with the obvious. The Mongols didn't care about your GPA, or whether you could list 3 of your weaknesses in a humble yet self-aware tone. They cared about one thing: your ability to ride a horse and kill a man without falling off. If you could do that, congratulations, you were basically middle management. The Mongol army, at its height, was the most terrifying force the world had ever seen. It didn't function like a traditional army. It was a mobile death vortex with terrifying logistics. And, to join it, you had to be born into the life. Recruitment started at age 3. Literally, Mongol boys were taught to ride before they could fully walk. Their training ground was the endless steppe. Their babysitters were horses, wolves, and the ever-present threat of frostbite. By the time a boy reached 12, he could shoot a bow while galloping at full speed, cook marmot stew with no utensils, and survive a snowstorm by sleeping under his horse, not beside, under. If you flinched at that, you probably wouldn't pass the first round. Still, it wasn't all family-born talent. The Mongols were practical. If you were a conquered enemy, and you didn't resist too hard, they might recruit you. Smiths, engineers, translators, they had value. But if you wanted to be a proper nucker, a warrior companion to a Mongol general, you needed more than a steady hand. You needed loyalty, courage, and a stomach that could handle fermented mare's milk without sobbing. Let's imagine your interview. You've been brought before a local commander. You don't bow. You salute in the Mongol style, right hand clenched, brought to the chest. He sizes you up. You're offered a horse. No instructions. Just ride. You jump on, and the beast takes off like it's personally offended by your presence. You hang on. You don't scream. Good start. Next, you're handed a bow. You must hit a target 300 meters away while riding at full speed. You miss once, twice. Third time, bullseye. You don't smile. Mongols didn't smile during assessments. Unless they were about to burn something. You're handed a knife, told to gut a rabbit, with your eyes closed. For fun. Then you're told to sit silently in a freezing yurt while your potential superior throws out insults. This isn't cruelty. It's part of the culture. Mongols valued composure, stoicism, and the ability to sit through verbal abuse without breaking eye contact. You pass. Now comes the oath. You pledge loyalty to your leader, your unit, and Genghis Khan himself. This wasn't a casual promise. Break your word, and you didn't just lose your job, you lost your head. Maybe your families too. Still watching? Let's dig deeper. The Mongol recruitment strategy was ruthlessly effective because it valued function over form. They didn't care about ethnicity, language, or religion. You could be a Turk, a Chinese farmer, a Persian cartographer. If you were useful, you were hired. If you were loyal, you were promoted. If you were both, you lived longer than most. Officers were often promoted from within based on ability, not nobility. That meant even a low-born warrior could rise to command thousands, provided he kept winning and didn't complain about the lack of sleep or constant saddle rash. But don't romanticize it too much. Life in the Mongol ranks was harsh. You shared everything: meat, horses, shelter. Privacy was non-existent. Show weakness, you'd be quietly cut out of the herd. Cowardice in battle, punishable by death. Excessive pride, also punishable by death. Basically, if you weren't dead yet, the system would keep testing you until you were. And yet, for many, this was an opportunity. A chance to rise, to belong, to carve out a name, sometimes literally, on the skulls of your enemies. The Mongol war machine ran on discipline, fear, and terrifying efficiency. Soldiers were expected to ride for days without rest, eating dried meat, drinking blood from their own horses, a delicacy, truly, and surviving on little more than adrenaline and existential momentum. There was no room for ego. Units were organized by tens. 10 men, 10 tens, 10 hundreds, all the way to 10,000. Every man knew his role. Every order came from above. And if your superior fell, the next took over instantly. No confusion, no democracy, just execution of both plans and people. But here's the curveball. Despite all the brutality, the Mongols were surprisingly forward-thinking employers. They enforced strict laws about looting, ensured fair division of spoils, and rewarded bravery with tangible gifts: horses, weapons, gold. They respected competence above all. You didn't need a noble lineage, you needed results. And if you didn't deliver, well, the Mongols had no retirement plan. Bonus points if you didn't flinch when the Khan glared at you. So, you're looking for a career with stable hours, a steady income, and room for advancement? How about becoming a medieval executioner? The pay was decent, the tools were provided, and you got your own little plot of land. The only downside? Everyone despised you, feared you, and crossed themselves when you walked by. Also, you had to professionally decapitate people. But hey, nobody's job is perfect. The job of an executioner in medieval Europe wasn't exactly posted on a bulletin board. There was no job fair booth titled "Heads Will Roll, Apply Within." No, this position was usually inherited. If your dad was the executioner, odds are, so were you. Congratulations, you're the family disappointment. By law. Why? Because no one else wanted to do it. Executing people came with a massive side dish of social stigma. You were essential to the legal system. Like courts literally couldn't function without you. But that didn't mean anyone invited you to dinner. You lived outside town walls. You drank alone, and your children couldn't marry into respectable families unless the in-laws were deeply confused or owed you a favor involving a sharp axe. So how did people become executioners? Sometimes they were criminals themselves. A judge might offer a condemned man a choice: die today or kill people for the state tomorrow. Not exactly a dream offer, but better than the alternative. Other times, towns forced someone into the role. In one recorded case, a man tripped and accidentally helped the hangman at a public execution. The crowd cheered. Officials decided, well, he's clearly got talent. And boom, career change. Training? Oh, there was some. If you were lucky, an older executioner might take you on as an apprentice, teach you how to properly swing a sword, position the body, or avoid splashback. A clean execution was the goal, quick, precise, and hopefully not traumatic for the audience. Because yes, this was public entertainment. Bring the kids, get a meat pie, watch someone lose their head over tax fraud. But make no mistake, if you botched it, if the axe slipped or the rope didn't tighten right, or the quartering was more of a half-hearted ache thing, you didn't just get booed, you got scorned. You might even be punished. Irony, thy name is mid-execution decapitation. And while executions were the headline act, executioners did a lot more than just swing steel. They administered torture. They handled branding, flogging, and amputations. They disposed of bodies, many of which were criminals, plague victims, or just really inconvenient corpses. They also worked as animal control, catching stray dogs and removing dead livestock from the streets. If something was gross, bloody, or morally questionable, odds are the executioner was responsible. Let that sink in. You're legally required to kill people on Tuesdays, remove bloated corpses from the river on Wednesdays, and deal with aggressive geese on Thursdays. Friday's your day off, assuming the local law doesn't need someone drawn and quartered before the weekend. Still, the pay was surprisingly solid. Executioners were state employees. They got stipends, sometimes lodging and often perks. In some places, they had rights to the clothing of the executed, or could keep a portion of any confiscated goods. A nice, if macabre, retirement plan. Some even became quite wealthy, assuming they didn't mind spending their gold alone in a house no one dared visit at the edge of town next to the cemetery. Because here's the brutal truth. Society needed executioners, but it didn't want them. In many towns, executioners had to wear distinctive clothing. Some had bells on their shoes to warn people they were coming. Others carried a staff, not out of dignity, but so people could keep a safe distance. You couldn't buy from the butcher. You couldn't drink at the tavern. You were marked, both literally and socially. And yet, Despite the isolation, some executioners found pride. They saw themselves not as killers, but as instruments of justice. They kept order. They enforced the law. Some even published memoirs, gruesome philosophical accounts of their work. One famous German executioner, Franz Schmidt, kept detailed journals of every person he executed. 361 in total. He approached his job like a surgeon, with a strong sense of penance. But even the best couldn't escape the weight of their work. Executioners often turned to drink, or religion, or just silence. They were feared by children, avoided by priests, and regarded with a mixture of awe and disgust. The very thing that gave them purpose also isolated them completely. Is job security worth social exile? Think about that the next time you consider a high-stress role with long hours. At least no one throws cabbage at your head for doing your job. If you've ever struggled to choose between two terrible job offers, say unpaid intern at a startup versus assistant manager at a haunted Wendy's, spare a thought for young boys in the Ottoman Empire. Their options? Become a eunuch or a janissary. One involved castration and palace intrigue. The other involved battlefield trauma and probable death. Either way, the HR department was God, fate, or a man with a clipboard and a very cold knife. Let's start with the eunuchs. In the Ottoman court, eunuchs were the ultimate insiders, gatekeepers to the Sultan's palace, trusted with guarding the imperial harem, and given enormous administrative power. But the interview process, less tell me about your leadership style, more you'll never father children again. And also here's a robe. Most of the Ottoman eunuchs were captured or purchased as slaves, often from East Africa or the Caucasus. Once in the system, they were castrated, usually completely, before being trained for palace service. Their survival rate was grim. The surgery was performed in brutal, unsterile conditions. If they survived the physical trauma and the sepsis, they might get a chance at a relatively stable life. If not, well, someone else would fill the position. But if they did survive, they entered a strange sort of power paradox. Black eunuchs, especially those assigned to the harem, became some of the most influential figures in the empire. The chief black eunuch, or Kızlar Ugası, could control palace access, issue royal decrees, and even influence succession. A eunuch with no family, no heirs, no personal ambition, only loyalty to the Sultan, was seen as the safest pair of hands in a palace teeming with conspiracies. So yeah, you didn't apply. You were selected by destiny. Now let's look at the janissaries. They weren't castrated, but they were taken. The Devshirme system, implemented during the 14th and 15th centuries, was a state-sponsored child recruitment program. That's the softest possible way to say we're going to take your Christian son from his village, forcibly convert him to Islam, and train him to kill people in the name of the Sultan. Boys between the ages of 8 and 18 were selected, often the strongest, smartest, or most promising from Balkan regions under Ottoman control. Families wept, villages protested, but resistance was usually futile. Once taken, the boys were marched to Istanbul and divided based on aptitude. The physically impressive became janissaries, elite infantry. The intellectually gillifit were trained for administration. The rest, palace service or labor. For janissary recruits, life was strict. They were forbidden from marrying, owning private property, or growing facial hair during training. They lived communally, slept on mats, trained with weapons, and endured brutal physical regimens. Obedience was absolute. Their loyalty to the Sultan was drilled into them daily. He was father, god, and employer, rolled into one ominous figure in a jeweled turban. But here's where it gets interesting. Janissaries, like eunuchs, rose through the ranks. They could become commanders, governors, even kingmakers. Over time, they became a powerful military and political force, sometimes more powerful than the Sultan himself. They staged coups, set policy, and demanded pay raises, usually with swords. One group was made sterile, the other celibate. Both were forcibly taken as boys. Both were molded into hyper-loyal, terrifyingly competent institutions. One served in velvet hallways, the other on muddy battlefields. It's almost poetic, or tragic, or both. Still watching? Let's play compare and contrast. Autonomy? Janissaries eventually gained some, until they got too powerful and were violently disbanded in the 19th century. Eunuchs never had autonomy. They were trapped in a velvet cage, rich in silk, poor in choices. Fear factor? Janissaries inspired terror on the battlefield. Eunuchs inspired quiet dread in the palace. One killed loudly, the other killed careers. Upward. Mobility. Both had it, ironically more than most freeborn Ottomans. You could rise to unimaginable heights, but only if you survived being torn from your life, reshaped and rebuilt in the image of empire. Retirement. Janissaries eventually married, owned land, grew glorious mustaches, and drank coffee by the Bosporus. Eunuchs died alone, often buried near the palace, remembered only by those who feared them. So which recruitment was more brutal? That's like asking whether it's worse to be struck by lightning or slowly submerged in cement. One was sudden, one was suffocating. Both were irreversible, and both fed a system that relied on boys becoming tools, clean, loyal, and expendable. Let that settle in your mind. You're 10 years old. You're told you've been chosen for greatness. You'll live in the capital, wear fine clothes, learn languages, rise in power. But your name, your faith, your body, none of it will be yours anymore. You weren't hired. You were claimed. If you thought becoming a samurai was just about learning to swing a sword and look intimidating in lacquered armor, think again. In feudal Japan, the path to becoming one of these elite warriors was less insert sword, become legend, and more endure years of rigorous training, compose emotionally devastating poetry, and learn the proper way to sit in silence while contemplating death. Yes, it was violent. Yes, it was deadly, but it was also somehow deeply poetic. Let's start with the basics. Samurai weren't born, they were forged. If you were lucky enough to be born into a samurai family, congratulations, you already had a foot in the door. If not, well, good luck. Unless a lord personally noticed your skill, or needed a warm body with good posture, you'd spend your life admiring katana from a respectful distance. The apprenticeship process began early. By age 5, boys from samurai families were already learning archery, horseback riding, and the fine art of not crying during sword practice. Their education was holistic, martial discipline balanced with intellectual refinement. Because in Japan, stabbing someone efficiently was only half the job. You also had to reflect on the moral implications through a well-crafted haiku. By the time a boy turned 12 or 13, he was often assigned to an older samurai as a kosho, or page. This was your foot-in-the-door position, polishing armor, preparing meals, observing etiquette, and generally not screwing up. If you proved obedient, respectful, and able to maintain eye contact without bursting into tears, you might be allowed to train alongside your master. But the real goal, earning the right to wield a katana. The katana wasn't just a weapon, it was a soul. Literally. Samurai referred to their swords as their soul blades. You didn't get one because you asked nicely. You earned it through discipline, humility, and proving you wouldn't use it to slice open the pantry door at midnight. Swordsmanship was taught through kenjutsu, a brutal, beautiful form of combat that combined precision with fluidity. Imagine ballet, but every misstep could end with your kneecaps relocated. And while learning to fight, you were also memorizing poetry, calligraphy, history, and philosophy. Samurai were expected to be literate, articulate, and introspective. They studied Bushido, the way of the warrior, an unwritten code that stressed honor, loyalty, frugality, and the importance of dying well. Not dying eventually, dying well. That meant gracefully, with dignity, preferably with a short farewell poem, and no screaming. Still watching? Good. Let's talk job review. If your lord thought you were loyal, disciplined, and had the emotional control of a stone lantern, you might be promoted to full samurai status. This came with the right to carry 2 swords, the long katana and the shorter wakizashi. It also came with social status, a stipend of rice, and the legal right to kill commoners who insulted you. Which sounds dramatic, but if you failed to meet expectations, well, one apprentice famously misquoted a haiku during a tea ceremony. His master, insulted beyond measure, dismissed him immediately. Another accidentally spilled ink on a genealogy scroll. He was given the choice, exile or ritual suicide. He chose exile, then later wrote a book about ink-related trauma. True story. Mostly. The samurai world was unforgiving. If you broke the code, disobeyed your master, or brought dishonor upon your clan, you were expected to commit seppuku ritual suicide. This wasn't just punishment, it was redemption. You knelt, composed a final poem, and sliced your abdomen open with your short sword, while a trusted companion stood by to deliver the final, merciful blow. Let that sink in. You trained for decades to become a warrior poet, only to die because you blinked at the wrong moment during a bow. Yet for many, this path was worth it. Samurai served their daimyo lords with absolute loyalty. Their lives were rigidly structured, with rules governing everything from how to address superiors to how to fold their clothes. The upside: respect, honor, a place in history. The downside: near-constant anxiety, existential dread, and the possibility of being disemboweled because your poem had bad meter. And they did write poetry. Haiku, tanka, death poems. Samurai believed that clarity in death came from clarity in life. Many left behind verses so beautiful they're still taught today. One wrote, on the eve of battle, even in my dreams, I charge into battlefields. My heart never rests. Imagine putting that on your performance review. In the end, samurai apprenticeships were as much about becoming emotionally disciplined as physically lethal. They didn't just train warriors, they molded identities. Every test, every mistake, every verse was a step along a narrow path, one paved with ash, blood and brushstrokes. So, you want to be a jester, you've got wit, a flair for theatrics, and an oddly high tolerance for getting slapped with a goose feather while wearing bells on your shoes. Perfect. Because in medieval and Renaissance courts, jesters weren't just comic relief, they were political lightning rods with punchlines sharp enough to draw blood. And their job interviews, 1 part talent show, 2 parts psychological landmine, and always performed in front of someone who could literally have you executed mid-joke. Let's clear something up first. Not all jesters were drooling simpletons in rainbow tights. Some were sharp as razors, cunning as courtiers, and far more educated than the nobles they mocked. Others were hired because their physical or mental differences made them entertaining. Yes, history is gross. Let's continue. The path to jesterdom wasn't standardized. There was no jesters' guild, no clown college for sarcastic intellectuals. Most jesters were discovered. A noble might spot a quick-witted street performer, a poetic drunk, or a child with an uncanny ability to insult without blinking, and poof, you're in the big leagues. Auditions were usually impromptu. You'd be summoned to court, told to perform, and if you made the king laugh without offending him, congratulations. If you didn't, well, you'd better hope your insult landed just ambiguously enough to be interpreted as satire. Because here's the terrifying reality: the jester lived and died by nuance. Make the king laugh.
You're a genius. Suggest the queen's wig looks like a dying squirrel?
You're either hilarious or heretic. It all depended on timing, tone, and how recently the monarch had eaten. One wrong word, and your set ended not with applause, but a sword. But jesters weren't just there to amuse. They were allowed, sometimes expected, to speak truth to power. Their humor cut through courtly flattery. A good jester could mock royal policies, point out hypocrisy, or hint that a campaign to invade France might not be going so well, all while juggling turnips. They were truth-tellers, wrapped in bells and absurdity. Let that sink in. You made a living saying what no one else could, with your life hanging on whether the king found your delivery clever or treasonous. Still watching? Let's break down the job description. Duties: entertain the court with jokes, songs, dances, mimicry, animal impressions, and the occasional impromptu puppet show using leftover chicken bones. You had to be a walking Renaissance TikTok channel, versatile, viral, and vaguely cursed. Hours: whenever the king was bored, which was always. Pay decent, considering the risk of spontaneous beheading. Some jesters were granted titles, homes, and even land. Others were paid in wine, bread, and not dying. Perks: unprecedented access. You could interrupt royal dinners, speak freely in court, sit near the throne, mock ambassadors, and sometimes advise on state matters between pratfalls. Risks: everything. All. There's a reason many jesters developed a style heavy on wordplay and ambiguity. Shakespeare's fools, for instance, often spoke in riddles. It wasn't just for poetic flair, it was a survival tactic. If nobody could quite pin down what you meant, nobody could quite execute you for it. And let's not forget physical comedy. Some jesters specialized in slapstick, tumbling, acrobatics, or pretending to be drunk for laughs. Others wielded satire like a dagger. In one recorded case, a jester responded to a noble's threat with, "If wit were swords, my lord, you'd be unarmed and sobbing." The court roared, the noble fumed, the jester lived. There, but the emotional toll. Jesters were both visible and isolated. Beloved but ridiculed, trusted but never equal. They were exempt from court protocol, but never from court politics. Their laughter masked loneliness. Their mockery masked vulnerability, and sometimes they died forgotten, buried with their bells, and no one to mourn them. Yet others became legends. Take Troubalet, jester to King Francis I of France, famous for his razor wit. He once insulted the Queen. The king ordered his execution. Troubalet, ever the tactician, asked for the right to choose how he'd die. The king, amused, agreed. Troubalet replied. Of old age, the king laughed and spared him. What does it say when humor was a survival skill? It says the line between comedy and catastrophe was razor thin. That jesters weren't just funny. They were essential. They spoke what others wouldn't. They made the unbearable bearable. And in their laughter there was often pain. So if you're ever tempted to complain about a tough boss or awkward job interview, remember the jester who stood before a throne, juggling knives and words, praying his punchline didn't cost him his head. If you've ever met someone who seems way too excited about filling out a spreadsheet or color-coding their bookshelf, just be glad they weren't alive in the 1600s. Because back then, a disturbingly enthusiastic personality could earn you the job of Witchfinder General. And the only required qualifications? Paranoia, sadism, and an unshakable belief that women talking to their cats meant the devil was present. The title itself, Witchfinder General, wasn't even official. It was more of a marketing brand cooked up by one very ambitious man, Matthew Hopkins. Think of him as the startup bro of early modern England, except instead of launching an app, he launched mass hysteria. Hopkins operated during the English Civil War, a time of political chaos, religious tension, and general suspicion that someone, somewhere, was hexing your wheat. He claimed divine authority to root out witches, which in practice meant interrogating poor villagers until someone cracked, usually along with several ribs. And make no mistake, this was a business. Hopkins charged local towns for his services. His fees included transportation, room and board, and a bonus if you wanted your witches tested the deluxe way, aka swimming, where you tied a woman to a chair and threw her in a river. If she floated, guilty. If she sank, innocent, but also dead. Let that sink in. This man built a career off of you're either a witch or a drowned non-witch. Congratulations. Still watching? Let's go over the application process. Step 1. Be a man. Because of course. Step 2. Memorize some Bible verses. Not all of them, just the spicy ones about witches and devils. Step 3. Acquire the tools of the trade. These included a sharp pin for pricking witch marks, a long stick for dramatic pointing, and a notebook to record confessions you coerced at 3 a.m. using sleep deprivation and threats of eternal damnation. Step 4. Have no soul. Not technically listed, but heavily implied. Hopkins wasn't the only witch hunter, but he was the most famous and the most prolific. In just a few short years, he was responsible for the deaths of over 100 accused witches, mostly women, all poor, many elderly. His methods were deeply flawed, wildly inconsistent, and enthusiastically cruel. Interrogations were conducted in dungeons, barns, or just dark corners of pubs. Suspects were sleep-deprived for days, watched closely for unnatural behavior, like talking to themselves or sighing too much, and examined for devil's marks, which were basically any blemish, mole, or oddly shaped freckle. Even a third nipple could be grounds for execution. So yes, ancient dermatology was a death sentence. And here's where the job got really unhinged. Hopkins claimed that witches had familiars, small demonic creatures that fed on their blood and did their bidding. These familiars had names like Piowacket, Vinegar Tom, and Grizzle Greedigits. If this sounds like someone naming their Dungeons & Dragons characters after their breakfast cereal, you're not wrong. But it worked. People were terrified. Villagers testified. Trials were held. Rope was knotted. What started as a few isolated accusations became a wave of panic. Hopkins travelled from town to town, his reputation preceding him like a plague. Mayors hired him, juries feared him, and accused women, often widows, midwives, or just the village weirdos, rarely stood a chance. And the kicker? He wasn't even qualified. Hopkins had no legal training, no religious ordination, no government authority. He was, at best, a failed lawyer with a flair for drama. But in a time when fear was currency, that was all he needed. Eventually, even the authorities got nervous. In 1647, public sentiment turned. People started asking inconvenient questions like, is this man profiting off mass murder? Or, why does our town treasury now have zero money and a pile of dead grannies? Hopkins published a self-justifying pamphlet because of course he did, then died shortly after. Probably of tuberculosis, not a witch's curse, though we can dream. So what do we make of this job? It required no credentials. It had no oversight. It caused irreparable harm. And yet, it was celebrated briefly as necessary, moral, even heroic. What kind of system hires you for your capacity to destroy lives? One where fear outweighs facts, where cruelty is mistaken for courage, where the most dangerous people are the ones who believe they're righteous. And yes, it paid well. Evil always does. Imagine this. You're sitting in a fluorescent-lit conference room nervously sipping lukewarm water from a plastic cup, waiting for someone named Deborah from HR to call your name. The walls are beige. The clock ticks too loudly. Your resume is triple-checked, your shoes polished, and your biggest worry, that you'll forget the buzzword synergy. Now imagine instead that you're standing shirtless in a Spartan training yard, holding a spear longer than your last relationship, surrounded by 12-year-olds who could kill you with a glare, or that you're being grilled by a Chinese magistrate after a 4-day exam marathon that included writing poetry, solving math equations, and not pooping in your examination cubicle. Suddenly, that awkward Zoom interview doesn't seem so bad, does it? Throughout history, job interviews weren't interviews. They were trials by fire, fate, or absurdly specific qualifications. They weren't about finding someone passionate about data hygiene. They were about survival, obedience, or knowing how to quote Confucius while decapitating a guy. Let's recap. If you lived in ancient Egypt and wanted to be a temple scribe, you had to prove you could write perfectly, recite entire scrolls from memory, and possibly eat ink as a loyalty test. Don't choke. If you applied to be a Viking crewman, your recruiter was an axe-wielding warlord named Bjorn, and the only questions asked were can you row and can you scream loud enough to terrify a monk. As an aspiring gladiator, the hiring manager checked your teeth like a horse, slapped your thighs and said, yeah, he'll bleed well. You didn't get the job, you just got chained to a cart and told to learn fast or die dramatically. In the Inca Empire, some job postings were divine callings. Literally, you were chosen from birth to be sacrificed in a ceremony because the omens said your skull was symmetrical. The benefits package included death, honor, and absolutely no retirement plan. Let that sink in. Your dream job was also your funeral. Still watching? Still reflecting? You know what to do. Let's make it personal now. What if you had to interview in one of these eras? What if, instead of a cover letter, you had to memorize every verse Confucius ever uttered, backward, or survive a Mongol blizzard with nothing but a horse blanket and an inspirational quote, or make a medieval king laugh while tiptoeing around his gout-fueled mood swings? What if your job depended not on charisma, or credentials, or even competence, but on being in the right place, with the right-shaped mole, at the right time, in front of the right God King? The terrifying thing is, people still do this, not literally, thank heavens, but modern interviews still carry echoes of these ancient absurdities. You're asked to sell yourself, to fit the culture, to perform not just as a professional, but as a personality. You smile, you nod, you perform enthusiasm, you juggle experience, charm, and likability like a medieval fool trying not to lose his head. And sometimes, the job still goes to the boss's nephew. So what do we really want from work? Not just a paycheck, not just a title, but something deeper, something ancient. We want purpose, stability, recognition, maybe even legacy. We want to matter. In every era, through scrolls or swords, tea ceremonies or blood rites, people have sought meaning through labor. Some were exploited, some were exalted, most were forgotten, but all of them, in some way, were asking the same question. Do I belong? That question echoes through every temple scroll, every battlefield, every court jester's joke. It echoes in cubicles, studios, kitchens, and fields. It echoes in you. So tonight, as you lie back, eyes heavy, remembering that email you forgot to reply to, breathe a little easier. You didn't have to stab anyone. You didn't have to memorize Confucius. You didn't have to wear bells on your shoes or drown to prove your innocence. You just had to show up. And sometimes, that's enough. History's worst job interviews were brutal, weird, and sometimes weirdly familiar. If this walk through professional nightmares made you feel grateful for HR emails instead of sword duels, hit that subscribe button. Your ancestors would want you to, especially the ones who didn't get hired.